With the boats gone, a curious calm came over the ship. The excitement and confusion of that phase of the drama were over, and those left behind stood quietly on the upper decks, trying to keep as far away from the rail as possible. One man opened his wallet and poured his money over the side of the ship, while others played on the gymnasium's equipment, and one lady played the piano, waiting for the end. As the freezing water appeared to be rising towards the boat deck, as opposed to the boat actually sinking into it, there were hopeless efforts to clear 2 more collapsibles lashed to the roof of the officers' quarters. Passenger Jack Thayer felt far away, as though he were looking on from some other place. 60 feet below the deck, deep down in the boiler rooms, the engineers and firemen toiled away in a stifling and dangerous heat, trying to keep Titanic's lights glowing and her power to transmit messages strong. Quite a number worked down there until almost the last minute, and there was nothing else that could be done, and the engineers finally released them. And by the time many of them came up to the upper decks, the lifeboats were all gone. In the wireless shack, Phillips was still working the set with Bride standing by, but the power was very low. At 2:05 a.m., Captain Smith entered the shack for the last time. "Men, you've done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. Now it's every man for himself." Phillips continued working, sending his final wireless message at 2:10 a.m., while Smith went round the ship releasing different groups of workers, repeating the every man for himself mantra. Some jumped for it and managed to reach the lifeboats. Others stayed on board to see what fate had in store. By the forward entrance to the grand staircase, the band, now wearing life jackets, scraped lustily away at ragtime. The calm continued for a while on the boat as people braced themselves for the drama to come. Within the ship, the heavy silence of the deserted rooms had a drama of its own. The crystal chandeliers of the a la carte restaurant hung at a crazy angle, but they still burned brightly. Some of the small table lights had fallen over. The main lounge with its big fireplace was silent and empty. One passer-by could hardly believe that 4 hours earlier the room had been filled with the most exquisitely dressed ladies and gentlemen sipping after-dinner coffee. According to Walter Lord's book, A Night to Remember, the smoking room was not completely empty, and a steward had apparently looked in at 2:10 and found Thomas Andrews standing all alone in the room with a stunned look on his face. Lord writes that his life jacket thrown away and all his drive and energy gone. Andrews didn't answer when asked if he was going to try and save himself, and simply gazed at a large painting of Plymouth Harbour called The Approach of the New World, which hung above the elegant marble fireplace. However, later research found that the incident happened prior to the steward leaving the ship at 1:30 a.m. and that Andrews had been seen on the bridge at 2:10. Out on the deck, people waited, some prayed, and the band played on. Others seemed lost in thought, a mass of humanity awaiting its fate calmly and still without too much outward panic. Hundreds now accumulated at the stern of the ship. They had only 10 minutes to live at this point, though they wouldn't have known that and would perhaps have retained some faith in the great ship, that it would last longer than expected, or even perform some kind of miracle with a hitherto unknown safety feature magically kicking in at the last moment. Reflection time was short, but perhaps the ignored ice warnings would have played on Captain Smith's mind, the last one telling him exactly where to expect the berg. Phillips could ponder the ice warning that he had replied angrily to earlier, which had never reached the bridge. At 2:10 in the wireless shack, Phillips continued to work, Bride later talking of the reverence he felt for him amid the chaos of that last 10 or 15 minutes. He and Bride knocked unconscious a stoker who tried to take Phillips's life jacket, deliberately consigning him to a certain death. He had reached several ships by now, who were steaming towards the stricken liner. Other than the Carpathia and later the Californian, it's unclear at what point they turned back or if they reached the spot. 10 or so miles away, the mystery ship was seen off the port bow, agonizingly close. When the wireless operators finally cleared out, Phillips disappeared and Bride joined the men trying to free collapsibles A and B. It was a ridiculous place to stow boats. With the deck slanting, it was impossible to launch them, but they decided to float them off, so they toiled on, including Lightoller. Boat B was pushed to the edge of the roof and slid down on some oars to the deck, landing upside down. Boat A was a struggle as well, and the men were tugging at both collapsibles when the bridge dipped under at 2:15 and the sea rolled aft along the boat deck. There was a sudden crowd of passengers pouring up from below, who all seemed to be steerage passengers. The band was still there, and at this moment the ragtime ended and the strains of a slower song, led by violinist Hartley, flowed across the deck and drifted in the still night far out above the water and within earshot of the boat. Howard Bride remembered this song as the hymn Autumn, though his testimony was later proved to be somewhat flawed in a number of respects. Most would claim that the song played at this point was Nearer My God to Thee, which would of course have had an unbearable poignancy and would become an anthem of later dramatic representations of the disaster. Down dipped the Titanic's bow, and its stern swung slowly up. As the tilt grew steeper, a wave went surging aft up the boat deck, hitting dozens of people and crashing through the dome of the forward first-class staircase, destroying the dome itself and sending huge amounts of water cascading inside it. The forward funnel toppled over, striking the water on the starboard side with a shower of sparks and a crash of tons of steel heard above the general uproar. It was actually a blessing to Lightoller Bride and the others clinging to overturned collapsible B, which was washed 30 yards clear of the plunging, twisting hull by the force of the wave and the falling funnel. Colonel Archibald Gracie rose, as if on the crest of a wave at the seashore. In the process lost his friend Clinch Smith, with whom he made a pact to remain together to the end, forever. By the fourth funnel the ship was swinging higher and higher, and Survivor heard a popping and cracking, a series of muffled thuds and the crash of glassware. The slant of the deck grew so steep that people couldn't stand and instead slid into the water. Amid the chaos, no one knows exactly what happened to Captain Smith except his tragic final demise. He was seen just before the end by a steward walking onto the bridge, still with his megaphone in hand. Bride saw Smith dive from the bridge into the sea, and he was also seen later in the water by a fireman holding a child. Those in the boats either watched in absolute silence or buried their heads on each other's shoulders, unable to look. Seen and unseen, the great and the unknown tumbled together in a writhing heap as the bow plunged deeper and the stern rose higher. At 2:18 a.m. the lights went out, flashed on again, and then went out for good, plunging all involved into a horrifying darkness. Not quite though, as a single kerosene lantern flickered high in the aftermast. The muffled thuds and tingle of breaking glass grew louder, and a steady roar, a cacophony, thundered across the water as everything not bolted down broke loose. There has never been a mixture like it. Among the mind-boggling array of items were 29 boilers, 800 cases of shelled walnuts, 15,000 bottles of ale and stout, huge anchor chains each weighing 175 pounds, 30 cases of golf clubs and tennis rackets, tons and tons of coal, 30,000 fresh eggs, 5 grand pianos, a 50-phone switchboard, 2 reciprocating engines, a revolutionary low-pressure turbine, 8 dozen tennis balls, a cask of china for Tiffany's, an ice-making machine and 16 beautifully packed trunks for the wealthy Ryerson. Out in the boats they could scarcely believe their eyes, some having watched for nearly 2 hours as the Titanic ominously sank lower and lower, hoping against hope that God or someone would save them. They saw decks and decks of people waiting, looking like bees milling around and hoping. Survivor Ruth Becker remembered that the ship looked beautiful in the dark night, the ocean like a mill pond. As the bow sank, some headed for the part of the deck not yet in the water, postponing the plunge and in fact lessening their chances by being crowded with others. First Officer Lightoller instead jumped for it, later describing hitting the water, at this point 4 degrees below freezing point, as like 1,000 knives being driven into my body. The lifebelts were largely futile in water like this. Next was heard a different kind of sound, a tremendous booming, cracking, popping, explosive sound, which was the ship breaking in two between the third and fourth funnels. As the bow fell, the stern settled back, and even now it may have seemed to some that the stern might hold and become its own lifeboat. Alas, it came to an even keel just briefly, before rising to be perfectly perpendicular, and then going down on its own. When the final plunge happened, it was the most horrifying moment of all. Beauty of the night turned to a violent ugliness. There was an unearthly din, a black hull hanging at 90 degrees against a Christmas card backdrop of brilliant stars. There was also a groan not unlike a primitive leviathan in the throes of death, as the Titanic slid under, picking up speed as she went, and then she was gone. A collapsible sea, Ismay bent over his oar, unable to bear seeing her go down. Many in the boats just sat freezing cold and in a daze, showing no emotion. And the Californian Stone and Gibson watched the ship that had fascinated them all night suddenly disappear. 20 minutes earlier at 2 a.m, the steamer's lights had been very low on the horizon, and the two men felt she must be steaming away, as they then told the captain. The sleepy lord asked the time and for details about the rockets and rolled back over to get back to sleep. As the sea closed over the Titanic, Lady Cosmo Duff Gordon remarked to her secretary, "There's your beautiful nightdress gone." A remark that you would like to think was ironic, but probably wasn't. The Titanic story was, no pun intended, a story of shallowness and depth. Later there were tales of great heroism and humans reaching out to each other, some sacrificing themselves to save others. Over the grave of the great ship hung a thin, smoky vapour. The glassy sea was littered with crates, deck chairs and many other objects that emerged from below. Survivor Eva Hart said later that the sounds of people drowning is something I cannot possibly describe to you, and neither can anyone else. Then there's a dreadful silence that follows it. It's truly impossible to imagine 1,500 people in the 28-degree, well below freezing water, screaming and thrashing around, clinging to the wreckage and each other. Every man for himself can bring out our most primitive instincts for survival, and our sense of our own civilized modern ways soon goes out of the window as we feel life ebbing away. For those who kept their heads and their stamina, collapsibles A and B, one swamped, one upside down, were two possible sources of escape from the most awful of watery fates. After the fall of the funnel had washed them away, some lucky and strong swimmers came upon them. Eventually there were 24 people, including a tennis star, a couple of Swedes, a fireman with badly burned hands, and a steward. Boat A drifted away, and the people kept coming. Collapsible B was closer, and those grasping for it were more vocal. Hyde and Lightoller were there before the Titanic sank, the former under the boat gulping for air. Colonel Archibald Gracie was there too, and hauled himself onto the boat, as did Bride. The boat wallowed under the weight of 30 men, and some were beaten off with oars. "One more will sink us all," someone on the boat shouted to those in the water. Another swimmer nearby never asked to come on, and was in any case too far gone to take hold of an oar and climb aboard. This may have been Captain Smith. Imagine in the water a man of his authority and rank. In the dark nobody would know who he was, but if they did, would and should he get special treatment? The instinct would be to prioritize his safety and still treat him as leader, but what was the right course of action? At this point in the dark, all were more or less equalized, their survival now a matter of physical strength, will, and luck, rather than ship status. Lightoller solved the riddle somewhat by displaying leadership qualities which would have been beyond most, with or without the freezing conditions, the horror of the situation, and the intense feelings of discomfort and despair. Therefore, his elevation to a position of authority was due to his practical step of physically taking charge, rather than having a symbolic right. Someone on the lifeboat suggested a prayer. Like everything on the Titanic, the religious denominations were various, and the Lord's Prayer was eventually settled on. The 712 survivors on the 20 lifeboats could scarcely comprehend having just witnessed the largest ship in the world, man's monument to civilization, technology and progress, disappear beneath the waves. But they now had a separate ordeal to face, one that would last for many cold and uncertain hours. While they were praying, other sounds drifted over the water, namely the sounds of hundreds of swimmers crying for help, a sound that was a roar, a scream, a wail that haunted survivors for years. Individual voices were lost in a steady, overwhelming clamour, rather like thousands of fans at a cup final, or locusts on a midsummer night in Pennsylvania. 20 minutes was about the time that could be expected for survival in below freezing water. The cries of the night meant one thing to lively, impulsive fifth officer Lowe: row back and help. Having escaped in boat 14, he'd rounded up 10, 12, 4 and collapsible D, and all 5 were tied together 150 yards from the ship. He took command, realizing that sending multiple boats was suicide, but reasoning that his small flotilla, manned by able seamen, could do some good. His 55 passengers were divided among the other 4 boats, and one boat went back. It was nerve-wracking work playing musical chairs with rowboats at 2:30 a.m. in the middle of the Atlantic, and Lowe was impatient with some while shoving a terrified young boy in disguise into boat 10. It took time for all this and for the number of swimmers to thin out to make the expedition safe, an agonizing thing to have to do, to let people die in 28 degrees in order to save others. It was after 3 a.m., but there was little left by the time they got there. Boat 14 spent an hour playing blind man's buff, listening to voices in the night, and only picked up 4 in the end. Third Officer Pittman decided to go back too, but one woman begged him not to sacrifice their lives in a useless attempt to try and save others. Pittman gave in, and Boat 5, carrying 40 out of 65, spent the next hour heaving gently in the calm Atlantic swell, while the occupants listened to the swimmers just 300 yards away. Boat 2 was also 60% full and did nothing. Others felt differently, including brave and spirited Molly Brown, who later inspired the play The Unsinkable Molly Brown. Her boat, number 6, 28 occupants out of a possible 65, went no closer, however, as Quartermaster Hitchens painted a vivid picture of swimmers grappling at the boat, which would be swamped and capsized. Fireman Henderson, in Boat 1, 12 occupants out of a possible 40, said they should go back, but Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, about as far from Henderson in terms of social class as can be imagined, said he didn't think they should try for fear of swamping, so the boat drifted aimlessly. Only 13 people out of over 1,500 in the water were picked up by the 18 boats. Number 14 was the only one that went back. Other survivors were picked up simply due to the close proximity of the boats. Why did trained men react so differently? And what about the passengers who survived in the boats? It is of course easy to say that they should have turned back, especially with the fact that some of the women would have known that it was their husbands screaming for help. But who could really blame them? At some point one's own life becomes the most important thing to the vast majority of people, and the very real fear of suction as the boat went down and swamping as a desperate clung to life and anything else they could hold on to kept them at a distance. As the cries died away, the night grew strangely peaceful. Eva Hart remembers that even as a 7-year-old, once the lights had gone out, the ship had gone, the cries had stopped, and all that was left was the blackness of the night, she felt that the world was, at that moment, standing still. The first drama had finished, but the shock, confusion, and excitement had not yet sunk in. A curious calm came over people, but loneliness also now set in. One passenger watched the shooting stars and thought of the insignificance of the rockets in comparison. Slowly life in the boats picked up, Fourth Officer Boxall firing off green flares from Boat 2 that seemed to bring people out of their trance and give them some cheer. Some thought the flares came from rescue ships, and the boats hailed each other in the dark while some drifted apart. With no compasses, they had no idea where to go. Passenger Lawrence Beasley, trying to calm a crying baby, discovered that he and the lady holding the baby had close mutual friends in Ireland. Touchingly, Mrs. Astor lent her shawl to a steerage woman to comfort her little daughter who was whimpering in the cold. She was thanked in Swedish. As if the sinking wasn't strange and surreal enough, now there was the curious phenomenon of the richest and poorest sharing lifeboats, a strange quirk of fate having brought them to a physical proximity that was disallowed by ship segregation, and which would never have happened in regular life. They now had a common purpose to their actions, the age-old need for survival. Their definitions of the word would have been remarkably different in civilian life, but the sinking had for a short time almost equalized them, as it had the 1500 screaming in the freezing water after the sinking. It was cold in the boats, one lady so cold that Pitman wrapped a sail around her. A stoker's teeth chattered, and another man looked so cold that he reminded the other passengers of a snowman. A woman collapsed, and in number 13 an elderly lady offered an extra coat to a man wearing only a thin jumper, but he refused and said it should go to a young Irish girl instead. There were a number of lady oarsmen, the wealthy Mrs. John B. Thayer in Boat 4 rowing for 5 hours in water up to her shins. In Boat 6, Mrs. Brown organised the women 2 to an oar, propelling the boat 3 or 4 miles in a hopeless effort to overtake the light that twinkled on the horizon most of the night. As the night wore on, the early composure began to give way. Mrs. Charles Hayes in Boat 3 continually hailing the boats that came near, repeating over and over, "Charles Hayes, are you there?" An Italian woman in Boat 8 screamed for her husband until the Countess of Rothes sat next to the Signora, rowing and trying to cheer her up. Squabbling broke out, often about trifles. One woman drove the others mad by constantly setting off an alarm clock. Many arguments revolved around smoking, and some women begged men to stop. This was of course decades before Edward Bernays, double nephew of Sigmund Freud, used his famous uncle's teachings for commercial purposes, one of which was to create generations of female smokers through a staged event where debutantes held up cigarettes as torches of freedom. Back in the sparsely filled Boat 1, Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon gave Fireman Hendrickson a good cigar while his wife was too sick to care, her head down and vomiting away the night. With only 12 in the boat, any squabbles were amplified. Fireman Pusey bemoaned the loss of his kit and his pay, telling Sir Cosmo that the latter could at least replace everything he'd lost. Cosmo gave him £5 to start a new kit, but the Duff Gordons' monopoly of the boat and refusal to row back made the fiver look somewhat like a payoff. When Lady Duff Gordon reassembled everyone for a group photo later, the others looked a lot like the Duff Gordons' personal crew, something the socialites found it hard to live down for a few years. In Boat 6, Major Poochen, used to giving orders, tried to take command of the boat, but Quartermaster Hitchens had other ideas, telling Poochen that his role was to row and keep quiet. Just before the sinking, he had urged the women in this boat to row harder, worried about the dreaded suction from the ship. The women had shouted back at him, and the night echoed with bitter repartee. The light on the horizon wouldn't be reached, and they were without water, food, compass or charts, hundreds of miles from land, and without a clue which direction they were heading. Hitchens ordered them to drift, but Mrs. Brown urged them to keep rowing just to keep warm. In the Battle of Wills, Mrs. Brown took the spoils, and Hitchens was rendered silent. Other society ladies, who had never lifted a finger in their lives, rowed in other boats, including Mrs. Astor in Boat 4, whose husband had been the richest man on the ship. As they weren't rowing back to pick up survivors, where exactly they rowed is open to question. Even in Collapsible B, as the men clung on for dear life, there was time for bickering. Colonel Gracie's teeth were chattering and his hair frozen stiff, but when he asked a man if he could borrow his cap, he was refused. Nerves were frayed on this boat as the air was leaking out from under the hull, and every minute it sunk a little lower in the water. The sea occasionally washed over the keel, and one impulsive move might pitch everyone into the sea. An air of horror and desperation hung over everything. They needed cool leadership, and the deep, rich voice of Second Officer Lightoller piped up and took command. Organised action was required, and he got all 30 men to stand arranged in a double column facing the bow and had them lean to counteract the swell. Lightoller spotted second wireless operator Bride and was told that the Baltic, Olympic and Carpathia were all on their way, and they searched the horizon for signs of anything to bolster their sagging spirits. Slowly the night passed, and as dawn broke, a breeze sprang up. The sea grew choppy, bitter waves splashed up into the boat, and the spray stabbed their bodies and blinded their eyes. One man after another rolled off the stern and disappeared from sight. The rest fell silent, completely absorbed in the battle to stay alive. The chief baker, Charles Joffin, had found an original way to stay alive. When the call had come to get to the boat deck soon after midnight, he had realized the need for provisions, and with his 30 men ransacked the ship's supplies of all bread, over 100 loaves in all. He then retired to his cabin on E-deck for a nip of whisky. He later hauled women up and threw reluctant ones into the boats and had refused a place in boat 10 as skipper because he didn't think it was right. He went back for more drinks, barely noticing the water reaching the top of his shoes. Around 1:45 a.m. he returned to the boat deck and began throwing deck chairs from B-deck, pitching 50 overboard, then retired to the A-deck pantry at 2:10 a.m., this time quenching his thirst with water. He'd reached the well deck as Titanic gave a sickening twist to port, throwing most of the people into a huge heap along the port rail. Joffin, alert but relaxed, displayed a remarkable equilibrium as the stern rose higher, corkscrewing to port. The deck was listing too deeply to stand on, and he worked his way up the side of the ship, holding onto the starboard rail until he reached the poop deck, which was the partial deck above the main one and at the back of the ship. He stood on the stern end of the ship, which had risen 150 feet above the water. As the sea closed over the stern, he stepped off into the water, not even getting his head wet. He paddled off, hardly bothered by the cold, and at 4 a.m. discovered boat P. Not able to get on, he trod water until a friend from the kitchen helped him on, still thoroughly insulated. All eyes now scanned the southeast horizon. At 3:30 a.m. they saw a distant flash and heard a far-off boom. A stoker in boat 13, almost unconscious from the cold, suddenly bolted up, recognizing the noise as a cannon. Soon lights began to appear and a big steamer emerged like an apparition, firing reassuring rockets to show that help was on the way. Captain Rostron on the Carpathia had done everything he could after the initial distress call had come through, but after that had come the waiting. Extra lookouts were there, all straining for any sign of ice or the Titanic, but there was just the glassy sea, the blazing stars and the sharp, clear, empty horizon. By 2:35 a.m. all was ready, and suddenly Rostron noticed a green flare. All on the bridge thought that it must be from the great ship, still afloat. Perhaps they'd be on time after all. At 2:45 a.m. a glistening berg was spotted, lighted by the mirrored light of a star. Then there were more. The Carpathia drove on, never slackening, twisting and turning and dodging icebergs on all sides. On they surged as the men breathlessly watched for the next berg and spotted more green flares in the distance from time to time. The Carpathia was firing rockets every 15 minutes, and everyone on the ship was ready and wild with excitement. A sailor later remarked that the old boat was as excited as any of us. However, Rostron's heart was sinking at 3:45 a.m. as he drew near the spot without a sign of her. At 4 a.m. they reached the spot and the ship was stopped. Another green flare blazed up, the flickering light showing the outline of a lifeboat about 300 yards away. In boat B they let out a yelp of joy. In boat 3, newspaper and a lady's straw hat were burned as signals. Others dipped handkerchiefs in kerosene and lit them, and Boxall burned a last green flare in boat 2. Cheers and yells rang out, and the dawn seemed to brighten in mauve and coral colours. The sky blazed with thrilling, warm shades of pink and gold. To the north and west, about 5 miles away, stretched a flat, unbroken field of ice as far as the eye could see. The sight was so astonishing that those Carpathia passengers who'd slept through everything until now couldn't grasp it at all, though some snapped pictures of history as they took photos of the lifeboats approaching. Rostron restarted the engines and headed for the light, but an instant later a huge iceberg loomed ahead, and he had to swerve it. As he edged towards the lifeboats, the sea grew choppy, and a voice from the dark hailed him. "We have only one seaman and can't work very well." It was Fourth Officer Boxall in boat 2. Next to him, a lady in near hysterics cried out, "The Titanic has gone down with everyone on board," and was sharply told by Boxall to shut up. On the Carpathia, all eyes were on the lifeboat bobbing towards the gangway, and they saw pale, strained faces and heard only a baby wailing in the boat. Lines were quickly dropped, and at 4:10 a.m. the first boat was picked up, and Miss Elizabeth Allen climbed slowly up the swinging ladder and tumbled into the arms of Purser Brown. She was the first passenger saved. Although he instinctively knew it already, Rostron confirmed with a shivering Boxall on the bridge that the Titanic had gone down. Day was breaking now, and other lifeboats could be seen all around, scattered over a 4-mile area. In the grey light of dawn, on what could be termed the first day of the new sceptical, realistic, modern age, the boats were hard to distinguish from scores of small icebergs that covered the sea next to 3 or 4 towering monsters of 150 to 200 feet high. Life started to stir on the Californian with the coming of the dawn of Monday, April 15th, 1912. Second Officer Stone brought his relief, Chief Officer Stewart, up to date about the strange boat with its 8 rockets, its disappearance, and the other rockets they had observed at 3:40 a.m. that clearly came from somewhere else. At 4:30 a.m. Stewart woke Captain Lord and repeated the story, the captain pulling on clothes and pondering how to work out of the ice field and get on to Boston. Lord didn't bother checking on the new ship to the south, which wasn't sending any signals, but Stone was moved to wake wireless operator Evans at 5:40 a.m. to tell him. Evans, who turned in for the night just before midnight, soon after being rebuked by Phillips on the Titanic for bothering him with ice messages, fumbled for the headphones in the half-light of day and tuned in. 2 minutes later, Stewart rocketed up to the bridge with the shattering news that the Titanic had struck an iceberg and sunk. At this point, it needs to be mentioned what was happening back in everyday civilian life, far from the drama on the sea. As we've already seen, the messages that had come from Titanic following the iceberg collision had been met with disbelief by the other ships, and the astonishing news of the CQD was also at that time filtering back to shore via Cape Race. In the city room of the New York Times, the managing editor of the paper studied the wireless messages and made a flurry of phone calls. On a hunch that would make his paper famous, he went out on a limb and changed the morning headlines to reflect the news that the Titanic had collided with an iceberg and started to sink by the head at midnight. The next day, the Times was the lone voice predicting the worst. In America, radio was the new toy and without restrictions, so someone who could put together a set could get on the waves and be informed as best they could from the often faint messages coming through. One message questioning who'd been saved on the ship got garbled to "all Titanic passengers saved." Since even today there's dispute over the total number of passengers, how many were saved and how many lost, it's not hard to imagine the confusion on that first day. In the New York offices of the White Star Line, however, unquestioning optimism reigned. Vice President Philip Franklin was accosted by reporters on Monday morning, but he assured them that inconvenience was the worst that the passengers had faced. Inaccurate news that the passengers were being towed to Halifax led to White Star sending trains to meet them, which were quickly turned back when it was established that the Carpathia had the survivors of the sinking. The gravity of the damage to the Titanic is apparent, but the important point is that she did not sink. Man is both the weakest and the most formidable creature on earth, and his brain has within it the spirit of the divine. He overcomes natural obstacles by thought, which is incomparably the greatest force in the universe, wrote the Wall Street Journal. By mid-afternoon, however, on Monday, April 15th, the tone had changed. On the roof of Wanamaker's department store in New York, there was a wireless station which had been set up purely for the amusement of its customers. A young man called David Sarnoff, who later achieved fame through RCA, Radio Corporation of America, and became a pioneer of radio and television, was one of the first to get the faint but clear message from the Olympic that Titanic had foundered with a huge loss of life. Once the news had been passed on, it was as if Bedlam had been let loose. Reporters besieged the White Star's office, and though Philip Franklin first talked only of rumours and the hope that all would be saved, by midnight he openly wept as the truth could no longer be denied. "I thought her unsinkable, based on the best advice. I do not understand it," said Franklin. This kind of disbelief would continue for days, weeks, months, and even years. What they saw from the boats as they approached the Carpathia looked like a picture from a child's book about the Arctic. The sun was edging over the horizon, and the ice sparkled in its first long rays. The bergs looked dazzling, white, pink, mauve, or deep blue, depending on how the rays hit them and how the shadows fell. The sea was now bright blue, and little chunks of ice, some no bigger than a man's fist, bobbed in the choppy water. Overhead, the eastern sky was gold and blue, promising a lovely day. The shadows of night lingered in the west, and a passenger remembered looking at the morning star which continued to shine long after the others had faded. Near the horizon, a thin, pale crescent moon appeared. The boats started to try and outrun each other to reach the Carpathia, and some in them began singing. There were organized cheers, while others remained silent, stunned by the sinking or overwhelmed by relief. On Collapsible B, Lightoller, Bride, Gracie and the rest were too busy trying to stay afloat and alive to cheer. Stirred by the morning breeze, the waves now washed over the boat and rocked it back and forth, each motion letting air escape and sinking the keel a little lower into the water. Under Lightoller's direction, the men had shifted their weight back and forth, but after an hour had become so exhausted that even the sight of the rescue ship meant little to these men. The Carpathia had stopped 4 miles away, and they wondered how they could last until they were spotted. Suddenly, as the light spread over the sea, they saw a new hope. Boats 4, 10, 12 and D were 800 yards away, strung together in a line. Lightoller fished an officer's whistle out of his pocket and blew a shrill blast. In number 12 the 20 men were faintly seen, and boats 12 and 4 made their way towards the officer, slow going despite Lightoller's encouragement. Finally the 2 boats arrived, but barely in time. Boat B was now so delicately balanced that the wash from boat 4 almost swept everybody off. Lightoller cautioned the men not to scramble, but the boat made a sickening roll as each man made the jump. It was about 6:30 when Lightoller finally got boat 12 off towards the Carpathia. Boat 14, containing Lowe, spent an hour trying to pick up survivors and only found 4. Some of the boats got away from each other. The swamped Collapsible A contained only 12 out of 30 had first swum to it, and it was abandoned after the passengers had been transferred. One by one the boats crept up to the Carpathia, the process starting at 4:10 and lasting over 4 hours. Ismay stumbled aboard around 6:30, mumbling, "I'm Ismay," and trembling. He refused food and drink, but requested a private room so he could be alone, the beginning of a self-imposed exile from active life. Within a year he had retired from the White Star Line and purchased a large estate on the west coast of Ireland, where he remained until his death in 1937. By 8:15 all the boats were in except number 12, still several hundred yards away and barely moving. The breeze grew stiff and the sea grew rougher. Now containing 75 people and the only lifeboat that could ever be said to have been filled to capacity at any point during the disaster, Lightoller nursed it along, and they got there at 8:30 a.m. as the crowd at the Carpathia's rail watched breathlessly. Lightoller and Officer Wilde had launched the boat, then containing just 30 people from the Titanic, 7 hours earlier. Upon arrival on the Carpathia, Harold Bride immediately collapsed. By now the Californian was standing by and agreed to search the scene while the Carpathia made for New York. The thorough rostron had one last look for survivors and found few traces of the great ship at her grave, just patches of cork, chairs, pilasters, cushions, lifeboats, and one body. A service was arranged in the main lounge, where those present gave thanks for the living and paid their respects to the lost. At 8:50, Rostron was satisfied there couldn't possibly be another person alive in the water, and ordered full steam ahead for New York, carrying 712 passengers. Those who made it to the Carpathia found blankets piled to the ceiling, brandy and hot coffee, an officer to meet each survivor, and eventually time to process and ponder their ordeal and the horrors they'd witnessed. Priority for the weak, bone-chilled survivors was of course to try and locate missing loved ones, and 12-year-old Ruth Becker searched for 4 frantic hours before finally being reunited with her mother and 2 younger siblings. Alas, a rare story of successful reunion. On the crowded Carpathia, people slept on floors and tables, and the passengers were later commended for many acts of kindness to those who came from the Titanic, many lending or giving away items such as toothbrushes and clothes, and offering their cabins without a murmur. Some passengers started getting on with their lives quickly, for others it took longer. Ismay, who'd been in need of sedation when he'd arrived, remained sequestered in the doctor's cabin, still trembling and shot with opiates, not appearing to eat, drink, nor see anyone. 17-year-old Jack Thayer sipped brandy and realized it was his first ever drink of hard liquor. Far below, the Carpathia's engines hummed with a swift, soothing rhythm. Far above, the wind whistled through the rigging. Back in Belfast, those from Harland and Wolff who'd built the ship were stunned by the news, as were those in Southampton, who contributed most of the crew. 549 men from Southampton were lost, leaving widows and fatherless children. The White Star office there was also besieged, but details were unclear and confusion reigned. Back in New York, the sinking was now officially accepted, though without the precise details. This didn't stop headlines being made about details of the sinking, however. The American press had already scapegoated and pilloried Ismay before he'd even arrived back on the Carpathia, once his survival had been made official. The rescue ship was offering no news to those awaiting it in New York, even refusing a telegram from President Taft pleading for news of his military aide, Archibald Butt. Captain Roston elected instead to save the wireless for official traffic and private messages from survivors, relayed by Officer Cottam with help from his Titanic counterpart Harold Bride once he'd recovered. It would be 3.5 days after the first reports before the wait for real news ended. On the evening of Thursday, 18th of April, the Carpathia approached New York City Harbour. As she edged towards Pier 54, 30,000 people lined the docks and the streets of Battery Park in the waterfront rain. The harbour had probably never witnessed anything as emotional and significant as the arrival of the rescue ship. As the Carpathia steamed up the North River, tugs chugged beside her, full of reporters shouting questions and money offers through megaphones. At 8:37 p.m. she reached the pier and began unloading the Titanic's lifeboats, which prompted gasps of emotion in the realization that these tiny craft were all that remained of the world's largest liner. 9:35 p.m. the first survivors tumbled off the ship to be met by reporters begging for a story. One reporter had got on the Carpathia and been promptly decked by one of the officers on the ship. Many of the survivors, such as Georgetta Dean, whose daughter Milvina would eventually be the final living survivor, now had children to raise alone in a strange new land. Many steerage survivors had the added confusion of not speaking the mother tongue. Some locals offered them dollar bills, yet more examples of human decency in dark moments. On the same day in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, the so-called City of Sorrow, the cable ship Mackie Bennett, manned by an all-volunteer crew and loaded with 100 coffins, set off on the macabre journey to search for bodies which had drifted away from the site of the Titanic's foundering and were being kept afloat by the life jackets that they wore. Over 300 bodies were found, ranging from the poorest immigrants to John Jacob Astor. The ship had limited embalming supplies, so severely damaged or unidentifiable bodies were committed to the deep at a depth of 2 miles, each burial preceded by the appropriate words. Remnants of the ship also remained, such as deck chairs and panelling from the lounge, the wood from which was carved onto a cribbage board by a crewman of the Mackie Bennett. The last body was found in June by a German steamer, the victim a table steward from the dining saloon. 356 bodies were found in all, but they didn't include famous names such as Benjamin Guggenheim and Captain Edward J. Smith, of whom all manner of stories would be recounted regarding his actions and whereabouts after the sinking. Both Smith and First Officer Murdoch were involved in rumours of an officer shooting himself in the head, an event that may or may not have taken place. Testimony from survivors were improved by reporters, and all manner of stories began to circulate, the public caught up in the excitement and not caring about the truth of the stories. As the famous Hollywood film director John Ford said, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." The public were overwhelmed, and King George of England and President Taft exchanged condolences. The official numbers, once they were in, were rather damning in terms of enormous and undeniable class discrepancies. 1,522 passengers and crew had been lost, and among the survivors the women and children first policy that had seemed to be the way of it didn't appear to square with the loss rate of third-class children being higher than that of first-class men. Though denied by the White Star Line, it became clear that steerage were to a great extent disregarded and forgotten. With perfect symbolism, their quarters were the lowest on the ship, and they'd struggled to get up top when the lifeboats started to be loaded. In the subsequent inquiries and survivor testimonies, it emerged that some of the crew had in fact barred the way to the boat deck for third-class passengers, symbolically keeping them down, or opened the gates without telling anyone. Some had been generously helped by passengers to get up to the deck, but most were left to fend for themselves. Some steerage met the challenge with enterprise, crawling along the crane from the well-deck aft, but most milled helplessly about their quarters, forgotten and soon to be lost forever. Just before the ship sank, Lightoller and others had been sure all the women had been seen off in lifeboats when they suddenly saw dozens of steerage women running towards the boats. Of the casualties, only 4 of 143 first-class women had died, 3 of those choosing to remain on the ship, 15 of 93 second-class women, and 81 of 179 steerage. Only 1 child of 29 in first and second class had perished, while shockingly 53 out of 76 steerage children had been lost. Nobody seemed to care about third class even after the disaster, including the press, who voraciously searched for news elsewhere, and the official inquiries. Only 2 out of 43 survivor accounts in the New York Herald came from third-class passengers. Congress's detailed investigation concerned itself with what an iceberg was made of. "Ice," said Fifth Officer Lowe. but only talked to 3 steerage passengers and didn't follow up on their testimony of being kept from going on the boat deck. No hush-up was required since there seemed no interest. At the British inquiry, the official representative of third-class passengers saw no discrimination, and a clean bill of health was given to the system that had failed the steerage passengers. However, no third-class passenger testified, and the only surviving steward stationed in steerage freely conceded that the men were kept well below decks as late as 1:15 a.m. The steerage passengers seemed to expect this and silently accept it, even as the ship was sinking. Regarding the investigations, since a British ship owned by an American company had been lost, 2 inquiries either side of the Atlantic were set up. The American Senate hearings started on April 19th in a ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and were at the same time theatre, psychodrama, and also a social event. J. Bruce Ismay denied trying to influence Captain Smith regarding the speed of the ship, and testified that he'd instinctively hopped into a lifeboat that was about to leave without being full. Ismay performed well, though the press sought to leap on and exaggerate any sign of weakness, and one paper listed "The Lost" on one side of a page, citing a handful of illustrious passengers, and "The Saved" on the other side, with the sole name of Ismay. Ismay stated that "My conscience is clear." 80 witnesses testified at the month-long hearings, and the maverick Senator William Alden Smith, who'd called for the hearings, sought to sue White Star for negligence, but found that no official violation of written law could be found, so no steerage passengers could be compensated at this time. Passengers and crew with complaints against the White Star Line would have to wait a lot longer for the meagre reparations handed out. The formula of limited liability meant that the damage money would be a proportion of what had been saved, in this case a mere 20 lifeboats. The figure White Star finally negotiated with the lawyers, $664,000 to American claimants and $3.5 million to British, was clearly higher than the formula demanded, but still a fraction of what had been lost in terms of life and property. After the New York hearings, the British crew headed home for Plymouth, where they had been summoned to testify at the British inquiry presided over by the distinguished Lord Mersey. Neither inquiry fixed blame on the IMM, the White Star Line, or its employees, but happily they both made clear the need for regulatory changes that still protect seafarers to this day. Never again would men fail to heed ice warnings or fling a ship into an ice field, putting all their trust in a few thousand tons of steel and rivets. From now, Atlantic liners took icebergs seriously and steered clear or slowed down. Nobody believed any longer in the idea of an unsinkable ship, and icebergs would be subject to the International Ice Patrol, a service that goes through the North Atlantic lanes and blows up icebergs before they become a hazard to navigation. Liners now had a 24-hour radio watch, so never again could the world fall apart while a wireless operator lay sleeping off duty just 10 miles away. Regarding lifeboats, the outdated safety regulations that Titanic had adhered to and in fact exceeded were done away with. The new formula was simple: lifeboats for all, and they would not be filled according to class. Even more than the great ship, her cargo, and the lives of 1,500 people, a lot more vanished on that fateful night. Since the disaster, class distinctions in this situation have been drastically reduced, or some perhaps rather optimistically say, eliminated. As happily often happens in the face of disaster, people rush to help, and in this case, relief agencies were set up worldwide to help widows, orphans, and penniless steerage passengers who finally received recognition. The seeds of a social conscience were sown by what is often required for this to happen, for humans to see past their own destinies and egos and tend to those more needy than themselves. However, disasters also need scapegoats, and as well as the new safety procedures, the inquiries also agreed on the guilty party. Although Ismay had been drawn and quartered by some elements of the press, the accepted villain was actually named by Ernest Gill, a crewman on the Californian. He offered an account of Captain Lord's disregard of the rockets and criminal negligence, claims that Lord scoffed at. It should be said that crewmen on very low wages were offered a year's wages or more for a story, which could later be embellished by a skilled newspaperman. Like Ismay, Lord was haunted by the fallout for the rest of his life, maintaining that a third mystery ship had been between the Californian and Titanic before steaming away, which accounted for Lord and the Californian's lack of action on the fateful night. When pressed by Lord Mersey himself at the British inquiry, Lord had said that "a ship in distress does not steam away from you." His protest fell on deaf ears, and he didn't receive the official exoneration afforded to Ismay and Captain Smith, instead made the official scapegoat for the entire disaster. Lord was fired by the Leyland Line just 4 months after the sinking, his reputation in ruins. He kept quiet for many years, but was upset by his portrayal in the 1958 film A Night to Remember, where he was depicted as sleeping in his cabin while hundreds were dying a short distance away. and was reinvigorated in his determination to clear his name. Lord went to see a man called Harrison, who was a General Secretary of the Mercantile Marine Service Organisation, of which Lord had been a member for 60 years. Lord explained that he'd been wrongly accused of allowing 1,500 people to die, and when Harrison took out the old files and examined them, he became convinced that Lord had a case. Who was the ship between the 10 or so miles separating the Titanic and the Californian? Speculation said that it was a Norwegian whaler called the Samson, which was illegally involved in the seal hunting trade and had steamed away when finding herself between the two boats. But it was later proved that the boat was in an Icelandic port at the time of the disaster. Lord died in 1962, a few months shy of the 50th anniversary of the disaster, and a full 30 years before his case was suddenly reopened. The findings were mixed, and although no question of murder was concluded, the suggestion of negligence was there to further torment Lord's family and fail to restore his tarnished reputation. First Class and the Well-Known would never have it so good as they had back in 1912. At that time there were no movie, radio or television celebrities, and cafe society was totally unknown. It was the prominent social figures who the public depended on for the vicarious glamour that enriches drab lives. When the Titanic sailed, the New York Times listed the prominent passengers on the front page, and after the sinking, John Jacob Astor's loss was given a prominent 2-page spread. He'd thought nothing of paying $800 for a lace jacket from a dealer on deck as the ship stopped briefly at Queensland. The wealthy Ryersons had 16 trunks of luggage. The 190 first-class families were attended to by 23 handmaids, 8 valets, and assorted nurses and governesses, not to mention all the stewards and stewardesses attending to their every need. In New York, the rich survivors were met by doctors, nurses, secretaries, special trains, and private cars. As stated earlier, a deluxe suite on the Titanic with its private promenade deck, one of which J.P. Morgan was due to sail in before his late cancellation, went for as much as $4,350 $1912. To put this in perspective, second wireless operator Harold Bride, on $20 a month, would have had to have worked for 18 years to make one trip in such style. The world of the Edwardian rich was close and intimate, and they would bump into each other at the Pyramids, the Cowes Regatta, or the Springs at Baden-Baden. And their mutual idea had been to take the maiden trip on the Titanic. After the collision with the iceberg, John Jacob Astor had learned of the damage to the ship from Captain Smith before the general alarm. The stewards and waiters working on the ship had often served the same elites and knew how they liked things done. Even the prosperous but relatively modest, by Astor standards at least, Thomas Andrews was helped to dress. The superiority of Anglo-Saxon courage was also loudly proclaimed on the Titanic, and the stowaways, those who jumped from the deck before the sinking, were all foreigners. At the inquiry, some Italians were presumed to have rushed the boats, the word being used to mean coward, requiring the Italian ambassador to demand an apology. The stoker who attacked Phillips was described as a Negro for effect. At the same time, some of the nobility of some of the men also disappeared along with the general chivalry of the time, tempered still by the gradual rise of feminism. Today, love and loyalty between families still exist, but little personal touches like going to the White Star Line in person rather than phoning to check on loved ones have disappeared with the times. The disaster also destroyed the confidence of the age and the feeling that an answer had been found to a civilized, orderly life. For the past 100 years there had been no war and a steady rise of technology and industry, and life was all right. The Titanic woke them up and gave technology and man's greatest achievement a terrible blow, shown to be ever so fragile beneath the grandeur of its very first trip. The Titanic disaster had equalized everyone in the water, and if wealth did no good then, did it mean anything the rest of the time? Ministers preached that the Titanic was a heaven-sent lesson to awaken people from their complacency. The lesson appeared to work, but more was required to press home the point. 2 years after the sinking, the technology that was supposed to improve mankind's life in an unbroken continuum of progress that would eventually lead to perfection was instead used in an exercise of mass destruction of human life in the First World War, the fallout from which was a large contributing factor towards an even greater act of mutual massacre 20 years later. The introduction of income tax in 1913 had already struck a blow to the Edwardian rich, whose lifestyle had been so on show on the Titanic. And then came the control of money by private interests through the Federal Reserve. The uneasy era had started, and the 20th century took a hammering. For 75 years, Titanic never left popular culture, and many secretly dreamed of finding the wreck, which lay nearly 3 miles down. Dr. Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, was the man chosen by fate to scale the underwater Mount Everest to make contact again with the great ship in a joint US-French expedition which was years in the making. The French had developed a piece of sonar technology to search the area around where the lifeboats had been picked up, and although the first search had yielded nothing, it had narrowed things down by showing them a large area where the wreck wasn't to be found. A month later, using Ballard's own Argo imaging system, a remote-controlled underwater video system, the magic moment finally came. The days had passed with endless, monotonous footage of the seafloor, and a feeling that a third expedition would be needed. Early hours of Sunday, September the 1st, 1985, however, those working the graveyard shift suddenly noticed anomalies in the otherwise smooth ocean floor. At first it was pockmarks that looked like small craters, then debris, a boiler, and the hull. Cheers went up, though they turned to an uncomfortable feeling when someone pointed out that the time was approaching 2:20 a.m., the hour that the ship had sunk. Ballard realized he'd come upon a graveyard, a place of lost souls. He would return a year later with well-advanced technology that could explore the wreck in close-up. After a 2.5-hour descent, Ballard could just make out a wall of steel that seemed endless. As the team's lights hit the wall, it was blazoned in colour and finally seemed real beyond the legend that had been building for 75 years since the first second after it had gone down. The portholes suddenly seemed like eyes looking back, perhaps even disapprovingly at the voyeuristic explorers. It was clear that the bow had plunged 2.5 miles in under 10 minutes, ploughing into the silt and forever hiding the gash that the iceberg had cut into her side. The stern had broken off and evened out briefly, which had led those still on it at the time to believe that it might hold, before it gave way and made its own plunge. On the ocean floor, the stern, swept relatively far from the bow, looked in 1985 like it had been hit by a nuclear blast. Ballard reasoned that the bow being full of water at the time of the sinking had made it pressure compensated, meaning that there was no air left in it. The stern, however, had held on to its air, causing a tremendous build-up of pressure that was released in an implosion on the way down. A mile of debris was scattered around between the bow and stern like salt from a shaker. They saw a smiling face appear, which was the head of a painted ceramic doll from the ship, perfectly preserved. Incredibly, there was still a variety of small creatures going about their day in the blackness of the ocean depths, some 3,800 meters down, where water pressure is 11,000 psi, pounds per square inch, something comparable to a single person supporting the weight of 30 Boeing 747s. The human bodies had been quickly consumed, of course, but due to the tannic acid used in the production of leather items, they, like the ceramic items, were perfectly preserved. On the stern, Ballard placed a bronze plaque, given to him by survivor Eva Hart in memory of her father, and the crew wept. Ballard had originally intended to keep the location of the wreck a secret, so as to stop others disturbing the grave, but this proved naturally impossible for an insatiable world. Emotional debates raged among historians, oceanographers and survivors about whether Titanic's treasures should be salvaged, akin to grave robbing in some survivors' eyes, or be left in peace. In 1994, after an extended court battle, exclusive salvage rights were given to R.M.S. Titanic Inc. The artifacts found, which included unmailed postcards, a passenger's leather bag last opened in April 1912, and a music stand that may have been used as the band played on right to the end, were painstakingly preserved and restored and put on display and are now viewed in various sites. The tastefulness of the displays and treatment of the items contrasts with a program called Return to the Titanic, which was broadcast in 1987. It was in the main an interesting program that featured several artifacts recovered from the ship, but host Telly Savalas, broadcasting live in Paris, was also charged to warm the audience up before each of the numerous commercial breaks with a continual build-up to the climax of the program, where a safe would be opened containing the jewels of the Edwardian rich that went down with the ship. No comment is required regarding the fictional film Raise the Titanic, based on a Clive Cussler novel. Following 1958's A Night to Remember, a well-made and relatively faithful adaptation of Waterlord's seminal book on the sinking, there was James Cameron's 1997 Titanic, which inserted a love story full of dreadful dialogue into the story, but also used CGI to far advance the 1958 film in terms of the drama and scale of the sinking. It was the most expensive film ever made and became the most successful ever. With the coming of the internet, there is now a treasure trove of information that keeps on coming, though debate still rages about certain details, including the aforementioned possibility that the ship that went down may have actually been the Olympic, deliberately sunk in an insurance scam. This possibility is roundly dismissed by the vocal majority, who have always been troubled enough by the sense of fate in the official account of the sinking. If the Titanic had heeded any of the ice messages, if ice conditions had been normal, if the night had been rough or moonlit, if the iceberg had been sighted 15 seconds sooner, if her watertight bulkheads had been one deck higher, if she'd carried enough lifeboats for all, if the Californian had had 24-hour wireless, and so on, things could have been different. But they weren't, and all went against her. A Greek tragedy. The best that has ever been possible since the disaster has been to weigh all the evidence carefully and give an honest opinion about what happened on the incredible night the Titanic went down, as well as trying to learn the hard lessons. The mystique continues to grow, perhaps because of the metaphorical value of the story. For most, the creep towards inevitable death is slow. On the Titanic on April 15th, death came relatively quickly to 1,500 people, but the hours leading up to the moment of truth may have seemed like a lifetime. There may also be sensed something significant in the fact that the Titanic story is one about water. That magical liquid covers approximately 71% of the Earth's surface, and we are all composed of around 65% of it as well. We depend on the fresh version of it for our survival, and as stated earlier, the wise man should also fear and respect it in terms of the vast bodies of water that contain it. Then there is the idea that as a microcosm, the whole world was on that ship, or at least a fairly comprehensive representation of extremes of lifestyle and temperament. The class system and the belief that the world couldn't actually be equal largely determined who lived and died, but at the same time imminent death sought to remove distinctions. At the same time that the privileged Lady Duff Gordon was making a remarkably shallow remark about the loss of her secretary's nightdress just as the ship went down, depths of emotions were also being felt that would in some cases take a lifetime to reconcile. The survivors later said that the disaster had brought on the rest of their lives a sense of calm and a new perspective. John B. Thayer, quoted at the beginning of this piece as saying that the world of today awoke on April 15, 1912, also said that nothing was revealed that wasn't known the night before, implying that there is something deep down in every person that knows the reality is never quite so. Perhaps the survivors found the ultimate reality, that every day must be appreciated to the full. The last words will be left to Michael McCoffin, curator of maritime history at Ulster Folk and Transport Museum, speaking, slightly paraphrased, at the conclusion of the fantastic two-part documentary Titanic: The Complete Story, which was a major source of what you have just heard. Titanic is seen in today's world as another example of man interfering with aspects of the natural world, and it lies there today as a lesson for the present and future. The continuing appeal of the Titanic does seem to be as a parable, a universal lesson in the mystery of the human condition, a dramatic revelation of man's nobility and his fallibility in this mysterious and capricious world in which we live.